Researchers often say that the most vivid memories are the ones that are tied to intense emotions. I remember the day I learned that for myself. It was because of an introduction. That day, I marveled at the bright summer sunshine as I walked from the event theater to the dining hall. I was feeling a sense of high and excitement after another session shared alongside hundreds of my peers. We shared in camaraderie, reflection, and growth that week, and were building friendships. Some just beginning and some that had been started years ago. Strolling across the well-kept grounds of the University of Notre Dame, I had a meeting to get to that was starting in a matter of moments. An important introduction needed to be made. I just didn't know it at the time. I was headed to lunch, but the meeting had begun without me. A few members of the meeting were already gathered in my absence, and another would be phoning in from a different state. Of course, this was typical for meetings in this modern age, as I'm sure you're aware. I imagine it was quiet, tense in the room. After all, what could be said about a meeting of this significance? Emotions were likely already running on high. I imagine the participants were peering at the floor, surrounded in silence. No one dared to speak, not until the leader called in. It was one of those meetings where no one knows what to say or how to begin. Perhaps you can think of a similar experience. See, this particular meeting held so much significance that two of the participants drove in from out of state just that afternoon. It was a last-minute measure, of course. You don't typically plan for meetings of this sort. Of course, I didn't know about the meeting. My invitation arrived late. It was by design, I came to find out, but not until later. On my way to lunch that day, someone came and tapped me on the shoulder. I recognized them as part of the leadership, but we didn't know each other personally. Chad Miles, right? They said. Yes, that's me, I replied. Would you mind joining me for a moment? They said. Being in a position of youth leadership myself that week, it wasn't out of the ordinary for organizers to speak with me, so I thought little of it. Looking back, I might have noticed that he spoke to me with tenseness in his voice. Looking back, I might have noticed he was a bit uncomfortable. Considering the contents of the meeting at hand, looking back, I wouldn't blame him. I had no idea I was being brought into a meeting that had already begun. The gentleman who had invited me, I found out, was participating in the meeting as well. The door opened to a new building and the meeting participants were gathered inside, quietly. It felt tense. Emotion wasn't just in the air, it was on the faces of all in the room. I immediately recognized two of the meeting's participants. Two men whom I'd spent a lot of time with. One for essentially a lifetime and the other on occasions of significance, as well as ritualistic meetings throughout the year. Familiar faces, to say the least. Something about how the meeting started didn't feel right. All eyes were on me, but why? I just found out about the meeting as I walked into the room. Was I expected to lead? It was then I realized none of the participants in the room were in charge of this meeting. The leader of this meeting was the person on the phone. One of the men was speaking to them quietly. He just walked in, he said. Here he is. I was handed the phone and I put it up to my ear. As I did, I looked around at the others, a mixture of faces that were dear to me and faces of people I had never met. They all shared a similar expression. A strange group for a meeting, I thought. But I was used to it. After all, this week was all about these sorts of meetings with new people. I heard a woman's voice speak to me on the phone. I immediately recognized it as a voice I'd been hearing for as many years as my memory lasted. She said my name as she typically would, especially when she was upset, and then delivered a short message. Just a few words. It was an introduction of sorts. She introduced me to someone I hadn't met before, at least not like this. Sure, I had been familiar with this individual, but not in this way. My previous encounters made sense in some ways. This was different. This was a different introduction. And just like that, the meeting was over. The introduction was made. Not a single word was spoken for minutes to come. How could anything be said? Not after an introduction like that. The meeting participants eventually parted ways. The convoy from out of town packed up and left to return to their home state, this time with an extra passenger in the car and an extra suitcase. That meeting and that introduction, most importantly, changed a lot of things for me. It changed a lot of things about me. It shifted my perspective on life. An introduction of that sort will do that for you. I lost my patience since that introduction, and I don't imagine I'll ever get it back. Since that introduction, I found that I make decisions more quickly and think more deeply about the reasoning behind them. Since that introduction, I look at the small things in my life in a new, more appreciative way and try to bring my awareness to more moments. Some introductions can be life-altering. Perhaps you've encountered the experience of meeting someone whose impact on your life is undeniable. As I look back now, I see how that introduction has been important in my life. Maybe, in fact, it's an introduction more people could benefit from receiving themselves. Not that I wish for people to be introduced so directly as I was, but that maybe an understanding of this person, this thing, would actually have a meaningful impact on people's lives. I know it did for me. And so, within that meeting, I received the most important introduction of my life, an introduction that changed everything. The person who introduced me, she had little choice. She was forced to introduce me, even though I'm sure she would have traded just about everything to hold off on this introduction for many more decades. On the day of this introduction, I was 17 years old attending a summer camp at the University of Notre Dame. I'll never forget when the camp counselors brought me into a room and I first saw my uncle and my older brother. I'll never forget when I heard my mom on the phone. She had a simple message to deliver, a simple introduction to make. Chad, there's really no way to sugarcoat this. Dad died of a heart attack this morning. Researchers say the most vivid memories are the ones that are tied to intense emotions. I can see why they say that. I can remember a lot about that day. After all, it was the day I was introduced to someone, rather, something, that altered my life. It was the day I was introduced to death. And I guess I hope to introduce people to death in a less direct way than my mom had to for me. Maybe I can introduce you to the ways it's changed my perspective, and maybe you could gain something too. After all, I think we're all in search of meaning in life. So whatever you do in life, I hope you make it meaningful.